Hey, welcome back to the Essential SQL Challenge, and today we're going to talk about joins, and you're going to want to stick around for this because this is where we start to look at how we pull data from different tables together. So we use SQL joins to match rows between tables, and in a sense, kind of stitch tables together to make it easier for us to read and use the table for final reporting and viewing. Now, you may wonder, well, why do I have to do this in the first place? And there's this concept called database normalization that actually takes our database and breaks it into little pieces. And there's many reasons why that's done, but mostly it's to help keep your database information intact and in good order. And I do have some really good articles on database normalization if you want to read them, and they do provide a good motivation for why you would see us take a database, some information, and kind of blow it up and spread it out across tables, and then go through all this work to bring it back together. And I think once you see how normalization helps the database, you'll understand why we need to use joins to bring the information back together. So with that said, we're really working in a relational database with all sorts of tables, and you've probably noticed if you've worked with tables in the past that a lot of times these tables have IDs, right? So you'll see some data like maybe the ship date, but then after that, all you see is like an ID, like an employee ID, an order ID. And the thing is that those IDs don't really tell you much. They're just a number. So to get context, you need to know like the employee's last name. And to do this, what we can do is use the information from the IDs in one table to match them to the information in another table. Okay, so here you can see where we have this order with employee number 4, right, whoever that is. And then what I can do is I can match or join this employee to the employee table, look up who number 4 is. I can see the name is Baker, and then in my result literally show the last name of the employee alongside the ship date. Okay, so this is called joining the data together. So the act of bringing these tables together to make this final result here on the right is called a join. And in fact, when we are joining the information in this way, we're using what in SQL would be called an inner join. And that kind of join is literally that to include rows in your output, both columns have to match. Okay. And it's one of the most used joins because typically you have a table like here where you have the order details and you're just kind of shooting out and looking up information like from other areas. So how do you write an inner join? So we're going to go into this a little more in later on in the lesson here, but in case you're curious how this all works, notice how the inner join is using some of the same pieces we've used in the past. We're selecting columns, okay? We're going to select them from a table. So like in this case, if I can zoom this back a bit. So in this case, we're selecting our table from orders, right? And then we want to join to employees. So notice I say from orders, and then there's that inner join I was talking about, and then I just say employees. So now I know, all right, there's an orders table involved, there's an employees table involved. Now that the trick is, how do I connect the rows together? And that's where this on clause comes into place. And what it will show is that you are joining on the employee ID from the orders table to the employee ID from the orders table. Now I have this got cut off, but this really should say employee ID right here. So one thing we haven't talked about is how you select columns in the list, because we've in the past talked about that you can from a table, select a column and separate it with commas. But how would you select columns from different tables? Well, you can just use the column name for the most part if the column name is unique across the tables. But a best practice really is to put the table name in front. And that also helps when you're looking at the query, because then you know which query it's coming from. So this is kind of like a qualified name, and this says to use the last name from the employees table, and this says to use the shipped date from the orders table. Now orders has to be defined in our query, and it's in the from clause, and employees obviously needs to be defined as well, and it is, because we're joining on that through our inner join. Okay, and that match is happening here with the orders employee ID going into the table employee ID. So that's kind of how that works. So really right now, just think about how the joins help you pull the information together. We're going to go into a couple of exercises in a minute here when we actually dig into like how the inner join works. But if you feel like you're kind of at a point where you're maybe getting the inner joins, but you want to learn a little more about it before we move on, then I would check out the article Introduction to Database Joins, and that's going to give you a pretty good overview of how joins work. Okay, and then once it starts getting into some of the nitty-gritty on an inner join itself, maybe stop there, come back to this video, and then we can go through the next tutorial. So really this one here is just all about just kind of understanding how things link, and the idea that we got tables that come together. And now that you have that understood, let's move on to how you can use this with an inner join. So let's look at a couple examples of how we can put an inner join together. But before we do that, let's just make sure we're all on the same page for what we think an inner join really is. So firstly, keep in mind that the inner join is the most common type of join that you're going to use in day-to-day queries. And why is that? It's because it's the one that allows you to really match a ID or a number in like your main table to go look up a value in another. Okay, so in tech terms, what you're really doing is you're taking a foreign key value and looking for its primary key in another table. But don't tell anybody I told you that tech stuff. So really we're going to combine one table to another and get a single result. And as we know, it's doing this by matching the columns from one table to the next. And only the combinations where those columns or those rows match with columns are kept. Okay, so before we move, let's go on and look at the general syntax for an inner join, and then we'll go down and look at this diagram. So again, the idea here with the inner join is that we're selecting columns from tables, and it can be any of the tables that are part of either in the from clause or in our join statements. So here we got table 1, which is in our from clause, but table 2 here, as you notice, is coming from our join. Okay, so the order is important. So the idea is you do a select, and then you're going to do a from, and then after the from you can put in your inner join statements. So after from we have the inner join, we're going out to our other table called table 2, and then here's where we're actually doing the secret sauce of matching the rows, right? So we're saying, okay, I only want to include you if match column on table 1 equals the same exact value as match column on table 2. If those things line up, then make a match and add that to my result. So now we're going to move ahead and start talking about how can you write an inner join on some data that we have here, and we're going to do it with 2 tables, and now move on to 3 tables. As we do that, we're going to refer back to this diagram, and so let me explain a couple of things in the diagram before we move much further. So this diagram was generated by SQL Server, and there's a couple of things here I think that are important to point out. First of all, the little yellow key indicates that this is the primary key of the table. So with that's really saying is that that's the unique ID of the table. Okay, you're not going to find two sales order ID rows in the sales order header table. Okay, there's only one ID value per row, and they're not duplicated. Now, what's interesting in sales order detail is they actually have two fields marked with a key. So together, these are the key. But notice how there's sales order ID in the one table, and then there's sales order ID in the other. Okay. So what's happening here is that this is the primary key. So this is like the main lookup. So if I'm on the sales order detail and I'm like, well, what sales order header does this really deal with? I'm going to take this ID here and then match it to the primary key on the other table. I think this becomes a little more clear when we work with product because I don't have these little key symbols everywhere. So think about it this way. I got a sales order detail and it says I'm product ID 56. Well, that's great. Are you a bike? Are you bike handles? What are you? So what I can do is I can take this product ID and then I match it to the product table who has product ID as its primary key. So there's always going to just be one and only one value of 56 in that table if it does exist, because I can't have more than one product with the same ID. So this becomes a perfect way to look up information, right? So I'm going to go out, I got that product ID, I look it up, and then I find out whether it's a road bike or a handle. So this is kind of how this works. And then these lines in between are indicating the relationship. So if I was working in the interactive tool, I could actually hover over these and it would say, all right, this table is being related by product ID between sales order detail and product. So let's look at how to do an inner join with two tables. So there's a couple of things I'm going to introduce here that to help out. First of all, is in the past we talked about how you can add the table name to the front of your table. Well, if you look here, my table name now has just gotten all the much bigger, right? It's sales order header. So one thing you can do is you can alias your table name. It's like giving it a shortcut. So I've done that. I've named my sales order header SOH for sales order header. And now I just put sales order header in front of the record or the columns that deal with the sales order header. And then the same when I'm doing the join on sales order detail, that's this table, I can use an alias, and here I'm using SOD for sales order detail. And you can see here's sales order detail. So what I'm really doing now is I'm bringing in couple columns from the header, and I'm bringing in 3 columns from the detail. And to make this work, we're using the sales order ID and matching that between the two tables. So this really is a join between the sales order header and the underlying details, right? So on one day, a store, for instance, said, you know what, we're going to buy some bikes and parts from Adventure Works. And so they bought maybe like 5 mountain bikes and a couple bike seats and some other things. And then the mountain bikes and bike seats will show up as sales order detail items. So that's what this will show us now, is that what day was that sales order created on and what were the products that came in. So let's run the query here and see what comes back. So now you can see we got the account number, what date it was ordered, the carrier tracking, the product, and the line total. So this information, the carrier tracking, product, and line total, are actually coming from that sales order detail file. Now I can sort on any of these, and if I wanted to sort on these, I would add the order by at the end, like we had talked about in the past. So I could sort her on, let's say, sales order detail carrier tracking number, and then run the query. So I always encourage you to try things and see how this works. Notice how they come up blank. So let's do that descending on it. And now they'll flip, right? Now they'll go from Z to A. See, there they are. From the highest value to the going down. So here, what I would do is recommend, trying some things to experiment. What happens if I, put 2 equal signs here? And what's the arrow look like? See, this is interesting. It says error near equal sign. So the trick here is you're like, okay, where's that at? Well, here's an equal sign. So you got to go, okay, what's wrong with this? I don't, is it the dots? Is it how I spelled it? Well, actually, it's the equal sign, right? So we know if I run it again, it'll work. If I accidentally put soda instead of SOD and run it, it should come back and say it couldn't find this, right? So that should be a clue as to, either this alias I wrote is misspelled, or maybe I misspelled my field. Because if I go like this, it's not going to come back and say you got the alias wrong and the column wrong. It just goes, you know what, I don't even know where this is coming from. So if I fix the soda part, oh yeah, it's only supposed to be SOD, and I run it, it still comes back. You're like, oh my god, it's still not fixed. Well, it's because the sales order detail ID is wrong. I gotta fix that too, right? So this is kind of how it goes with computers. They're so literate, sometimes it's confounding. So that is how you can work with inner join and also experiment with it. Now let's go on to a join with 3 tables. So before we do that, let's just go back up to the top, because you get too many commands going in the SQL, and it's like, whoa, this is getting crazy. But really, I think what you're going to find out is that when we go to 3 tables, it's not that much of a leap. All right, because we're already laying down the hard part with the foundation of that first join. Remember, the first join is really selecting columns from a table and then doing an inner join. So you got to ask yourself, if I wanted to add another table to the mix, what would I do? Would I rewrite this whole statement and somehow try to mash it together? No, I wouldn't do that. What I would do is I would literally add another inner join line underneath, right? So I got one join where I have the table joining, and then all I need to do now is yeah, go out and inner join to this other table. That's exactly what we're going to do. So let's go down to the bottom here, and when we do an inner join for the 3 tables, notice how, see if I can, notice how here it says sales order header and then detail, right? That's just the 2 lines. But now we're going to bring in the product. So it's the same, right? Sales order header and detail. Nothing's changed here. Now this is all the same. The one thing that's changed is now there's P name. That's interesting, because up here we had the product ID. Remember that? So where does P name come from? Well, this is from that 3rd join that we're adding, because now what we're doing is we're going out to the production product table, and we're going to bring in the product name based off of the sales order detail product ID that's listed on that line item. And when I run this, now you can start seeing product names come back. So this now is a result that's bringing back information from 3 tables. In fact, this query here now is bringing back information from all the tables that are listed in this diagram. That's pretty awesome, isn't it? So if you go in, I would definitely experiment and try some, bringing in maybe some other column names, because you could actually come up here and bring in the list price or the style. You can bring in any of the column names and check it out, because this is really good stuff. And I'll tell you, if you can get this down, then you are well on your way to now being able to pull in enterprise quality data into your Power BI reports or into your Excel spreadsheets and start working with it. This is going to give you enormous flexibility. And you won't just be sitting there going, okay, I got this one table of data, and I'm like, I can't make heads or tails of it because I don't know what these IDs mean. Well, now you know how to go out and get the IDs to make the table read the way you need it to read, so you can do your analysis. And that's what it's all about, right? So you can get your job done. So with that, I'm so glad that you were able to hang in here and take this bonus with me. And I fully look forward to seeing you in the future with more that I have to offer in Essential SQL. And thank you very much, and have a good day.